to the next phase of this operation, and we are going to start the fermentation process. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get ourselves a bucket, and I'll explain all these supplies that we're going to be using here, but we just need a bucket, you know, obviously something that hasn't been all outside and gotten all nasty. So this bucket looks kind of dirty, but it's actually just residue from the iodine that we're going to be using. So what we need to do is we need to put a bunch of water in here and just create a solution. The correct amount of iodine doesn't have to be precise, but basically you just want the water to turn orange. All right, so let's take a look at some of the items we'll be using here. We've got a thermometer, which I may or may not use. We've got an airlock, which is very important. We'll talk about that later. What we've got here, also, well, all of this stuff's important, but what this is yeast nutrient, and we're going to use that to make our yeast starters. First thing we need to do, however, is we need to sanitize our fermentation buckets. So you're going to need some of these buckets. I mean, I have about 4 of them, but you know, you need at least one, obviously. So we're just going to take this iodine solution, we're going to pour it in there, like so. It doesn't have to be a lot because, you know, it's heavy. You don't want to be shaking around a 50-pound thing of iodine. So basically what you want to do is just shake it around for 30 or 40 seconds and then you're good to go. So we're gonna reuse this solution a lot because we don't want to waste the iodine, you know, so you're just going to want to keep it in this bucket over here because you're going to use it to sanitize everything. And we're just going to rinse this out because we don't want iodine in our wine. All right, so we've got that rinsed out. Now, one point I wanted to make about the iodine is, you know, you really don't have to worry too much about the iodine. You know, you try not to get it into the wine, but after a couple of days, it just turns into water. So, I mean, it's not going to hurt you. Okay, so we've got here all of the juice that we squeezed yesterday. So, oh, that's clean, so we don't want to get that dirty. So yeah, it's good. Once you clean things, it's good to like stash them so that they don't get dirty again, because then you just have to sanitize them again. Okay, so we've got all of our pulp here. And one thing you'll notice about this is that it doesn't really look like wine. It's kind of mushy. So what we're going to do to remedy that is we're going to cut it down with water and we're going to add sugar to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pour all of this into here because this is clean. And I should have sanitized this yesterday before we started putting pulp into it, but I forgot. So hopefully that will not come back to bite us. And so what happens if you don't properly sanitize is that the fermentation just won't, it'll stall. It won't happen. So if that happens, probably 90% of the time, that's why. All right, so again, you can see it's not quite the consistency that we want. It's more like a juice or a jam. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to sanitize this bucket here because we're going to cut it down with water, and when we're doing that, because of the amount of material that we're working with here, we're going to want to ferment 2 buckets. One very important point when working with these buckets is to be really careful with the inside of the buckets. You always want to inspect them to make sure there's not any damage. So say for instance you were to scrape metal spoon against the inside and create some kind of a rough part, well, then your fermentation is going to stall every time because bacteria will live in those crevices. All right, so what I'm doing here is I'm basically just splitting this into 2 portions, and I'm just going to eyeball it. And you'll notice that these buckets have little scales on the side that show you how many gallons they have. So you can use, you probably can't see this, but there's a scale right here. And you can also feel it. So we've got 12 liters, otherwise known as a little over 3 gallons. Now, one thing to remember is it's important to keep your work area clean. So you see I've made a little bit of a mess here, and we don't want ants all over the place. And especially we don't want ants to get into the wine. And I mean, theoretically that shouldn't happen because your top will be sealed and you'll have a fermentation lock on it. But if we are having this sticky mess all over the place, it won't create a tight seal and it'll attract bugs. All right, now we've got all that cleaned up. Our area is relatively clean here. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add water. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use water right out of my faucet. We're on well water. It's really good water. A lot of stuff that you'll read online about water and wine is going to tell you that you need to use bottled water from the store or some kind of purified water. Now, I would like to direct you to a show on Netflix called Down to Earth. It's a really great show with Zac Efron. And the second episode, he talks all about water and how, well, just watch the episode if you're curious about water, and you'll find out why you should not be using bottled water. So I'm actually going to be using the well water, and in addition to that point, I'm going to be using hot water out of the water heater. And the reason I'm doing that is because we want the temperature of the water to be 70 degrees, because that's the temperature that yeast like. Yeasts are just like us. They like to be comfortable. All right, while we're waiting for the water to fill up there, we are going to talk about these. Now, this is how you're actually going to start the yeast into your liquid. And so what this is it's just orange juice. And the reason we use orange juice is because it's, when you put it in with the wine, you can't taste it afterwards. It just neutralizes. And also the reason we're using orange juice is it's high in sugar, and that's going to help the yeast to get started. So this came out of the refrigerator, so it is not 70 degrees. That's a problem, because if we put the yeast in here and then we put the yeast into the 70 degrees, it's going to get shocked, and it's not going to like that. And it may still work, but it's just going to take longer. What we're doing here is we're trying to make the yeast comfortable. So I'm just going to go ahead and stick this in the microwave and try to get it up to 70 degrees. So we'll do a real low setting. And that's totally fine to do because there's no yeast in here yet. So it's not going to hurt anything by putting it in the microwave. All right, now we've got our orange juice, and you can use a thermometer, but honestly I can feel that it's really close. Now when I say 70 degrees, if it's 72 degrees and the other thing is 68 degrees, it's not going to be that big of a deal, but you want to try to get as close as you can. But we'll just, for the sake of the camera, we'll check it out here, and that is pretty darn close to 70 degrees. Damn, I'm good. All right, so now we're over here to our liquid, our plum liquid, and we are just going to check the temperature on that too, because I have a feeling that it's a lot more than 70 degrees. All right, yes it is. It's about 95. So we're going to turn it on cold now to try to even it out. All right, so one very important item that I haven't mentioned yet is this plastic spoon. It's nice and long, and it's made out of plastic, so you won't scrape the inside of your bucket. and we do need to sanitize this. All right, now we've got our spoon sanitized, and you'll notice that I didn't fill the bucket all the way up. And the reason that I did not do that is because we're going to add sugar to it. Now, when you're normally making wine with grapes, you would not add sugar to it because you would not add any water to it. The reason that they make wine with grapes is because grapes already have the perfect sugar to water ratio in the grape. Okay, so we have our orange juice here. It's nice temperature, about room temperature. And that's another good point, is that it's about 70 degrees in here. So as far as the ambient air temperature, you want to maintain that because you want to keep your liquid, your wine, at that temperature for fermentation. Okay, so this here is our yeast nutrient. And what we're going to do is, I think they say to add a tablespoon of it. And what it does is it just quickly activates. It's basically just an enzyme or a compound that the yeast really likes to eat. So we're just going to add, I'm just going to eyeball it. We're going to add about a gram or maybe a half a tablespoon. I mean, it doesn't really have to be precise. Okay, good, we've got that. We'll just set that aside for now. Now I'm going to grab 2 packets of yeast here, and that's our yeast we're going to use. We'll talk about yeast and which kind of yeast to use on another video. But basically the different yeasts allow for higher or lower alcohol content. And I think this one goes up to, it doesn't say on the packet, you have to look it up. I don't think it says it on the packet, but yeah, there's books you can read about all that stuff, and it tells you what the alcohol content of the yeast is. Okay, now we've got everything we need in our yeast starters. We're going to pop the lid on there, and we're going to shake it up. And that's it. You do want to just crack the lid because there's the fermentation of the yeast creates CO2, and so you don't want pressure building up in there. Great. So this is going to take about 45 minutes. So what you'll know when it's ready, when it's all bubbly looking, and it even smells like bread when you open the lid. So we'll come back to that. All right, here's the next important item on our list here. This is called a hydrometer, and what this is just a little scientific tool that tells you how much sugar is in your liquid. And what it does that by measuring on this scale here, you can see, and it does it by measuring the buoyancy of this tool. And so where it lands in your liquid is what your alcohol content is. All right, so there's some bubbles in the way, but I can see that it was at 4. So that means if we try to ferment this right here, that it's going to be 4% alcohol when all of the sugar is consumed by the yeast. Now, I don't know about you, but I want my wine to be a little stronger than that, so we are going to add sugar to it. And what the sugar is going to do is it's going to make the liquid less dense, which is going to increase the buoyancy of this thing. And we're going to just keep adding sugar until we get it to the desired number that we want to see on here. Now, the number that I'm going to choose for this wine is going to be 12%. And it may not get to 12%, which means that the wine will end up being a little bit sweet. If the yeast consumes all of the sugar, then the wine will be very dry. All right, so we've got our sugar here, and I'm not going to go to the trouble of weighing it out just because, well, honestly, that's what the hydrometer is for, is to tell you what's going on with that. So I'm just going to take a guess. It's a 25-pound bag. I'm going to add 5 pounds and see where our hydrometer reading is. And in order to do that, the sugar, of course, has to be dissolved. So let's just take a minute here, stir it around, give it a good stir. Probably want to stir it for at least a minute. All right, so that sugar should all be dissolved in there now. And remember, we really want to try not to go over 6 gallons. This is technically 6.5 gallons, but if you take it all the way up to the very top, you're going to end up with a sticky mess once your fermentation starts. All right, here's the hydrometer, so we're going to stick it back in there. And it's important that you are cognizant of where you set things down, because you know this needs to stay clean. Okay, so now we are at 9%. So we're getting somewhere. So I'll add about another 3 or 4 pounds of sugar. And you can just stick this in your bucket that has the iodine solution in it. All right, we're adding some more sugar here. All right, that's gonna be just about right. Okay, so our hydrometer reading is 12.5. So that's good. That's good. If it gets up to 12%, then it'll be a little bit sweet. And yeah, we're gonna go with that. So I ended up using about exactly half of the bag of sugar. All right, so this bucket is good to go then. So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna get it up out of the way, so that no bugs or anything fly in there. And we've got clean lids and all right, so here's an example of what I'm talking about. I don't know if you can see that, but that lid has a crack in it right there. So really, this is useless. So I'm gonna throw that away. All right, so we've got the lid on here. We're gonna get this up out of the way. It's pretty heavy. Okay, and while we're over here, we can see what's happening. And you can see that the yeast is starting to form bubbles. It'll be really a lot of activity in there in about 30 minutes. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're just going to do the same thing that we did with the other one. All right, so at this point we need to put on an airlock. Mainly, we don't have the yeast in there yet, so there isn't going to be any activity in there. However, this would not be a good time for a bug to fly in there because that'll mess you up. We got 2 different kinds of airlocks here. They both work fine. I honestly prefer this one just because it makes a pleasant little bubbling sound, and it's just kind of nice to listen to, and especially if you have 4 of these buckets going at once. And so what you got to do is just fill it up with water here. You fill it up like halfway. And that's close enough. And you do want to sanitize these, which I did not do. I will do it now. And this may be common sense, but the reason I said you don't really need a thermometer is because, you can just use your hand as a thermometer. If it doesn't feel hot or cold, then it's roughly room temperature. All right, now we've got our airlock sanitized. And we're just going to stick it in this little hole here, and we're going to make sure it's nice and snug in there, and then that is safe. No bugs are going to get in there. There's no earwigs crawling around. That's good. Okay, so we're just going to set that aside. All right, so we've got our 2 buckets here of our liquid, and we're just going to wait 20 minutes or so longer for the yeast to be ready to be added in. All right, here we are about 20 or 30 minutes later, and this is what we've got here. You can see about the top half of that is all bubbly and yeasty, and that's exactly what you're looking for. So essentially that's what's going to happen in here on a much bigger scale. And it's got a little bit of a bread smell to it, mostly orange juice. And you do not need to stir it. It will make its way down in there and do its thing on its own. So we're going to do that same thing over here. And you want to be careful how you open the lids, because that's why that other lid that I had earlier was cracked, was because I was too rough on it when I was opening it. So you want to try to find the lip. There's a little divot on the bucket where you can grab the top, and so that you can be careful. One more point: when you're opening up these buckets here, that's kind of your vulnerable time, where it's the middle of the summer right now. So you've got to be really careful that you don't have a fruit fly or something other like that fly in there, because that'll ruin your day. Okay, so here we are about 24 hours later, and we are going to do a thing that is called punching the cap. So in order to punch the cap, we need this plastic spoon here. Normally you wouldn't want to expose your wine to the fresh air because you don't want it to oxidize. But in this case, the yeast does need to have just a little bit of oxygen. And let's take a look and see what we got going on here. Woo, look at that. That's good stuff right there. All right, so basically what we want to do is just make a hole in this, and we want to just churn it up a little bit. We don't want to churn it up all the way down to the bottom, because the bottom, actually down here, is where the dead yeast cells and stuff that's undesirable, it settles down there. So we want to kind of keep this not constantly mixing in with itself. So we want it to do its own thing in its own natural way, but we're going to punch the cap here. And what punching the cap does is it allows oxygen to get to the yeast. Yeast need a little bit of oxygen to do their thing. Normally, when you think of wine, you don't want oxygen because that causes the wine to oxygenate. So that's pretty much it. That's all you got to do, and you can see that it's nice and bubbly. That's good. That's what we want to see. It's creating carbon dioxide. This area in here, it's free of oxygen and it's free of the outside atmosphere. It's basically just carbon dioxide. And the reason for that is the yeast is creating carbon dioxide, and there's a positive airflow going out. So this is just carbon dioxide. In the next, after about a week, we're going to transfer it to this glass jug. It's actually called a carboy. And we'll show you that process next time.